Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today we have first-time reader of The God Is Not Willing, Dr. Philip Chase, and the
Hello.
author of The God Is Not Willing, Stephen Erikson. Hello.
First time writer of The God Is Not Willing.
That's true.
I know people will have hopefully watched the non-spoiler talk that Philip and I did on his channel, and then the spoiler talk that Philip and I did on my channel. But this was a sort of an extra one that we thought we would talk to Steve about the book. This is going to be spoilers for the Malazan Book of the Fallen, spoilers for The God Is Not Willing, because we just want to have a chat about the book. So with all that being said, Philip, because this is the first time that you've read the book, why don't you start us off?
Okay, well, I suspect that your viewers are going to want to hear the most from Steve. So let's start with a question for him, I guess. So as I was reading The God Is Not Willing, obviously there are connections going back to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. This is a new series, of course. It has its own voice, I think it's fair to say. And it has its own narrative, but of course, there are connections going back. And I was thinking mostly of House of Chains, the fourth book, and I thought a lot about Toll the Hounds as well. Would you say those are the two books that, in your mind, as you were writing this, were you thinking these are the books that I'm going to be dealing with most from the Malazan Book of the Fallen and going back and looking back?
I don't know, actually. So thinking about those four books. Well, yes, I remember going back and rereading the book one of House of Chains just to get grounded again and in terms of the storyline, and then following a bit of Damisk rather, to make sure that I left him alive when I left him off in the main series, because I couldn't remember.
Actually, Steve, on that point, didn't you post on Facebook or something asking
Yeah,
people what happened to him?
yeah, I'm so lazy. It's ridiculous. So yeah, I did some of that going back and reading over things. But generally, let me see. You said Toll the Hounds? No, I don't think I looked at Toll the Hounds. All I remembered was that I'd left Karsa in Darujistan, so I needed to bear that in mind.
Right.
That that's where he was going to be. And then it was, I mean, I did a total of 3 starts on this novel, and the first 2 starts on The God Is Not Willing are actually the starts of the second and third books.
Oh.
So I'm kind of ahead of time, ahead of my scheduling. And then Niflrog sort of came on board at some point and said that the second book has to be set in 7 cities for structural reasons. And I have to rethink that, because one has to listen to Niflrog. He's a smart guy, right? So
Pretty smart, yeah.
Yeah, I had to think, well, okay, maybe he's got a point there. But whether or not I actually go in that direction, I'm not sure. Basically, the trilogy in my mind initially felt like it was quite self-contained to the continent of Genabacus, and it was all going to occur there. But Niflrog does have a point. The weird thing is, when I was first taking notes, all my notes were based on 7 cities. So yeah, kind of strange that way, because I wanted to follow the rising of a new religion, the birth of a new religion, based on Coltane.
Right.
And because it would be a case where the reader actually was there at the most formative periods, and was able to witness things that these subsequent developers of this cult and the religion were not there for. And so they're going to be creating something and a belief system that's based on something that is changing over time. And I wanted to explore that. So in that respect, I was sort of thinking Seven Cities, but now I'm thinking maybe that is another standalone novel that sits between The God Is Not Willing and the end of the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Oh,
So I may head there at some point. Yeah.
wow. Well, that's breaking news. Or I don't know if you said this before or not, but that
No, in fact, I just thought of it now. So
okay. Great. All right.
But it's interesting you bring that up about the events that create a cult or create a religion, because
religion.
that's something that both you and Ian C. Esselmont have explored in the books about events in the past are almost misremembered or retold in very, very different ways in the present and gain different relevance or different resonance due to a reinterpretation. And it's something you did, particularly with the Karkanis books, is going back to what happened then. And even that version of events is so radically different from the idea that people had about it, because over time, narrative changes, meaning changes. So, you know, it's an interesting aspect that sort of is through the Malazan Book of the Fallen, through Karkanis, and also through the novels of the Malazan Empire.
Yeah, but I mean, for me, the impetus or the what inspired me was reading about the sort of the Apocrypha, the Gnostic text, and everything that was coming out of early the birth, I guess, of the Christian religion, and the fact that you had competing texts and competing accounts that were all over the place, and you know, it took sort of an institutional authority to come slamming down on it and decide what was going to be accepted and what wasn't. And so I wanted to sort of be in that original time period where there's a lot of different sort of flavors and interpretations of the events, and then I would explore all of those, and then how those cults end up competing with each other to the extent that eventually one becomes the dominant one and becomes sort of the codified religion. So I'll get there. I mean, I'm thinking to do something along those lines.
Huh. And we do have a cult of a sort that is in the process of discovering what it is in The God Is Not Willing, and and at its center is Karsa Orlong, who does not, as you know, if you've read the book, Karsa's not in the book. So, but he's in the book too, though, isn't he? And he is very much in the book. The repercussions of his actions in House of Chains as a young man are just everywhere. I mean, a lot of what happens in this book is a result of what Karsa did. So his legacy in so many ways, in terms of who the characters are, you know, but also the state of things. So he set quite an avalanche in motion, didn't he?
Yeah, and that was, you know, I realized quite, you know, that's why I did 3 different starts to this book, or to the trilogy, because I was trying to find my footing, and it was more a case of with each start, I realized I had to step back further in time, and that eventually took me back to the opening to The God Is Not Willing, and then I realized that there's no way I can squeeze Karsa into this story. He's going to have to wait, and he may have to wait through the second book as well. But he'll still have a pretty important role, because he's where the convergence is going to be. I mean, that should be obvious to any reader of my books. But this is a case where the convergence is being held off until the third book. So yeah.
So Karsa is a character who strikes me as a very interesting one for several reasons. One of them being, when I read about him in House of Chains for the first time, I did not like him at all. He did some awful things. But by the end of that book, I was sort of rooting for him. I found myself rooting for him. And it's interesting. I guess the question is maybe one of redemption, and to an extent. And I'm not sure that Karsa has redeemed himself, or that he is redeemed. Redemption is such a fuzzy thing anyway. I mean, in whose eyes are you redeemed? I guess that's the question that matters. But I feel like Karsa is still very much in the process of himself, even though he doesn't appear in this book. That his isolation in near Darujhistan has a lot to do with what he's done in the past. And in that, he's not too dissimilar from Damisk, who appears in the book, right? So the idea of redemption is something that you do write a lot about, never in the way that you completely define what it is, and I don't know if it is definable or not. So was that something you were thinking about consciously? Is Karsa still going through a sort of redemption here?
No, I don't think I don't think of Karsa in terms of redemption. Karsa is a very complex character and a very flawed character. But at the same time, he carries some certain elements with him that I'm aware will be very satisfying to a reader. Specifically, nowadays, anyways, his implacable sense of justice, which you saw, of course, at the end of the fourth book, House of Chains.
Yeah,
and it's pretty, clear cut. It's pretty black and white. It's fairly direct, and that's how he imposes his will and his sense of justice upon the world. That's a very volatile place to be and a dangerous place to be for someone who, for example, has charisma. And so that's kind of some of the aspects that I'm exploring with Karsa, but it's just sort of bubbling away on the back burner, because the story of The God Is Not Willing is a much more direct story, and it deals specifically with his legacy. And they have to step out of his shadow, these characters, and slowly find their own place in the world. And that's part of what this story is about. But in terms of redemption, I think a part of me wanted to redeem the Malazan Marines, and maybe in a more general sense, the role of the military within a civil society. Because, in the interim, here in our real world, we're seeing sort of abuses of civilian authority, quite often laid out against its own citizens. And I've always found that extremely disturbing and alarming. And so I wanted to sort of, I guess I wanted to rethink the role of that kind of organization within a civilization. And that, to me, was that aspect of redemption. You could call it redemption in a sense, but at least to redeem the ultimate purpose of these things, of these organizations.
Right. Interesting, because we here in the United States, we call them the armed services. And the idea of service, I think, is in the minds of the majority of those who serve in the military.
Absolutely. Right? But what often happens is the civilian side of things then turn that service and that organization, on its own people. And I don't mean just in the States, I mean, globally.
Right.
And that's where the abuse comes in, because that then separates out one segment of the population as the oppressors of another segment of the population within a culture, within a society, within a nation. And that's, historically, that's bad news when that happens. So,
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Because obviously this book has, I would suggest, like two major plot threads that run through it. One is obviously Rant's story and the points of connection to that with his mother, Sarlis, Damisk, and the rest of the T-Blor, and how they are sort of connected to that. And the other sort of main through line is the Malazans and their interaction with the mercenaries, and sort of the big convergence that happens at the end of the book. And so you can see that weighting of the sins of the father being revisited and the repercussions and impact that Karsa has had on the world. And these things have not been forgotten about. There are repercussions to his actions. It's not that you just dropped the character and went, I'm never going back to that. That these have had an impact. So that gets explored quite thoroughly and in a very focused fashion. And then with the Malazans, because we've seen the Malazan world itself continues to evolve. The world of Malaz at the beginning of Night of Knives in Ian C. Esselmont's book is not the same as the world at the end of A Seal in Novels of the Malazan Empire. That there's been a huge transition, and the Malazan Book of the Fallen falls between those two sort of historical points. And now, you know, Esselmont's going back further with the Path to Ascendancy novels, and we're seeing a lot of the early stuff. And now this is slightly later on. We see this constant change and evolution of the world. It hasn't remained static. And I thought that was a fascinating aspect of what you were doing with the Malazan Marines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the driving forces of technological innovation has always been military, like it or not. And so the idea of being stuck in a fantasy world where there is no innovation in the military side of things just does not make any sense to me at all. So I had to sort of think in terms of, you know, where is the dominant military force, which is the equivalent of the Roman legion in our world. How, you know, where is it evolving to, if not to mimic the slow sort of decline of the Roman legion in our history, late empire stuff. So I wanted to take it in a different direction and not be too obvious on that one. But so the military is definitely evolving, and at the same time, the people within it aren't entirely aware that it's evolving. It's just, you know, it's how they operate now. So when I threw in Spindle as a character, I wanted him to contrast between his memories of, you know, road building and bridge building and barrow building and all these, you know, all the engineering and earthworks, which is part of a skill set that people don't really think about when they think of you know, armies and legions and all the rest. But you know, they were as much engineers as they were anything else. And so I wanted, you know, him to remember his time walking through this landscape the first time around, and then the changes that are coming and the changes he sees.
Because that's the first time we meet the bridge burners in Gardens of the Moon, and we have that whole sequence where they're digging up the cobblestones in the road. You can, the Army Corps of Engineers, that this is a skill that these sappers, these soldiers had, because they have to do it convincingly. And we even see the evolution of that, because that was about mining these junctions. And over the course of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, we had the evolution of the drum. And we see the devastating consequences of this as an evolving form of technology in warfare, or a way of prosecuting warfare. That this is now a standard tactic to devastating effect in this novel.
Yeah, and I mean, it's got to be very difficult for the soldier, the military practitioner, to be witness to this and not pay a price. And so I really needed to explore that as well. And this is a book where they are able to offset that price by their final actions, because nature takes over, and you know, it overwhelms and trumps all other considerations.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's kind of a weird sort of theme to be exploring, at least in my mind, especially knowing that a lot of readers are really into the battles, and they want the warfare. They want to see the sword swinging. And so I knew I was going to be somewhat unplugging some of that, but also to recognize that as warfare evolves, it becomes less personal, and that's going to have a profound psychological effect upon the soldiers. the equivalent of somebody sitting somewhere operating a drone, halfway around the world and flying it into a building or something along those lines. I mean, there is a psychological consequence to being remote from this, to being distant from it. And I guess I'm probably venturing into exploring that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, I think your readers are probably aware that you're more interested in exploring the repercussions of warfare and what leads to it than in the actual violence itself. That's clear in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and it's clear elsewhere as well, to me at least. But there is an early epigraph in The God Is Not Willing that talks about the evolution of the Marines, particularly how the Malazan military as a whole, maybe the irregular soldier is probably not what it used to be, but the Marines, on the other hand, I remember, if you remember that, I don't remember which chapter that epigraph was, but I probably remember what I'm talking about. But
vaguely, yeah.
It's one of these historians writing about these things, but a lot of it has to do with magery, I think, right? And there is that scene near the end where these Marine mages are horrified at their own power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was a very, very haunting scene. So,
well, I mean, in a fantasy world where you've got magic at work, it takes the place of technology in some fashion. And just as with, technology related to destruction and devastation, it can be, shocking to witness the full wrath of that kind of technology, even if you have it surrounding you and have been immersed in its application, to witness. It's the equivalent of the napalm coming down from the skies, or even nuclear testing, that kind of stuff. So there is kind of a shock that reverberates through the witnesses of these things, especially if they are 100% responsible for the delivery of that stuff. And that's the side of magic where, I mean, it got explored the first time around in Lether, with the Letheri Empire, where it's just it was so raw and so indiscriminate that it was kind of a last resort kind of methods. So yeah, it's the evolution of things. I realized I probably had reached the point of saturation in terms of writing battle sequences. By the time I got to the end of Fall of Light, I just in my head I said, I'm not writing another fucking battle. I'm done with these. I'm done with these. So that's why Fall of Light turned out the way it did.
Which I thought was, I mean, without spoiling that, I guess, but I thought that was a brilliant way to handle that ending in Fall of Light. So yeah, I admire that very much. I was not expecting it. When I got there and I first thought to myself, what is he doing what I think he's doing? And then you did, and I thought, wow, okay. And I thought about it for a long time. So yeah.
Yeah, I was back and forth with AP was my advanced reader, obviously then.
Yes.
And I was back and forth all the time on the end of Fall of Light, because I wasn't sure if I could get away with what I was doing. And it may be that I didn't,
Well, you did for me.
Sales, I may not have. But I mean, the quote in The God Is Not Willing, the historian, and sort of the description of the regular Malazan forces as being, degenerate and all the rest.
Yeah.
One has to take all of that with a huge grain of salt, right? Because there are, and that's what I try to sort of undermine the authenticity of historians all the time.
No, really?
Yeah, I mean, as an archaeologist, why, of course I would. So yeah, I always sort of, it's tongue in cheek, a lot of the quotations from historians.
Interesting.
It's interesting how the evolution of the military, and you can map it onto the various periods of our history where a new technology comes in, and it revolutionizes warfare. It changes it, and people seeing that change get discombobulated. It can be very, very shocking. And the big change with the introduction, say, of the Gatling gun, changing warfare, the introduction of modern artillery, the introduction of chemical weapons being used. Each time it seemed that it was becoming more and more mechanized, more and more barbaric, and with a greater and greater devastating effect. And in this, we have not only are the Marines evolving into a unit that is combined martial and majory, far more so than earlier iteration, but also the more extensive use of munitions, and Annex Fro developing essentially, I suppose, like a rocket launcher.
I don't know what she was working on. I think it was more like a blunderbuss more than anything. Yeah, she's a bit crazy. And I'll run with that for sure. She was a fun character to write. More of a slow burn in terms of my interest of that character, but each time she showed up, on the page, I had more and more fun with Annex Fro. I mean, Stillwater took over almost instantly. She just arrived full blown and was just a joy to write. But Annex Fro and Banger, the illusionist, they sort of developed as it went, and became more and more interesting to me.
And then you had, of course, you mentioned before Spindle, who is one of our main, I guess, connections backward.
One of the few, yeah.
Yeah. It was so interesting for me to see things from his eyes as well. As one of the old guard, as one of the bridge burners who had seen so much, and you talk about that evolution and the changes over the years, and there's a kind of melancholy, of course, to this character who's seen, obviously he's seen a lot of stuff, and there's probably some PTSD and the losses.
He's left a lot of friends behind. Yes.
Yeah. There's this poem by Alfred Tennyson called "Tears, Idle Tears," and it's about this just thinking back to one's friends and one's loved ones, and the autumn of one's life, and that poignant sense of there's a sense of beauty in it too, but that loss is just such an overwhelming thing. But to see how things have changed in his eyes, as you said before, very powerful.
So you enjoyed the book? You haven't told me yet.
Oh, well, I actually have a bone to pick with you.
Okay.
Because, yes, I do, because I keep crying while I'm reading your books. And my wife and my daughters are teasing me about this. So
sorry about that.
Yeah, I blame you entirely. So, but no, it was a beautiful experience for me. The book was just sublime. So thank you. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
When I struggled with the style, I didn't know what style I was going to actually approach with. And it's almost been a problem for me since the very beginning of my writing. I can't even call it a career back then, but when I first started writing fiction, and I was in a workshop here in Victoria, University of Victoria, and I had a very, very good teacher, a mentor, Canadian writer named Jack Hodgins, who was new to the program and new to teaching creative writing, and was not yet burned out, because it burns out writers very, very, within, I'd say 6-7 years, most writers are burned out by workshops. Yeah. That's been what I've looked at and what I've seen. So he was still fresh to the whole thing. And he was talking, and he mentioned that I seem to be a writer who could just sort of choose any style. And while on one sense, that's a good thing, on another sense, it can be a bad thing, because because what can happen there is if you acquire a readership that's used to one dominant style that you've used for, say, the biggest project, like my 10-book series,
Right.
the expectation is the next books and all the other books are going to be of a matching style, because that's, quote, my style, right? I don't have my style. That's the problem, right?
You do, though. I would say anyway, and you can disagree with me, but I would say you have a voice. So whether I'm reading Bocaline and Cobra Brooch, or I'm reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or I'm reading Carcanis, or I'm reading this, I still hear that voice in there, even though the styles are all distinct. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that voice, however, defined simply by my diction
No,
and word choice?
that's only part of it. That's only
Part of
part
it?
of it. I think you have a sense of humor as well, that it is used more or less in various places, but it is something that is one of the markers for me for your voice. I think one would be your humor.
You've not read my Star Trek spoofs then, have you?
I have not yet.
No, okay.
We will do the Willful Child books
Yes,
on the
of
channels
course.
at some point, because I want to
yeah.
see Philip's reactions to them.
Yeah,
Because
so do I. So do I.
Philip,
Okay.
not really known for his love of science fiction television.
Mm.
Well, I mean, I do love, okay, so I like the original Star Trek. I didn't follow all the iterations of it, but I am a fan of Captain Kirk and Scotty and Spock and the gang.
Well then that trilogy is written for you, because
Well, good.
it is drawn off of the original series, and quite a few of the episodes of the original series are
Perfect.
including a couple of the films involving the original cast as well.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
see that's for me then, for sure. But to go back to the God is Not Willing, I did have a question too about the narrative structure.
Mm-hmm.
And you are, I think, fairly well known for not being entirely straightforward, not chronological with your story structure. Why did you choose to go in the way you did, where you had events happening and then you went back a couple days? And that is referring to, the flood that happens. We get to see it in on one front, and then we kind of go back a couple days. And I'm just interested in what you were thinking there.
Well, it was more a question of how else could I do it, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you think in terms of structuring a basic novel, where the main driving force is some aspect of the plot, and the plot being in most cases character driven. So it's the actions of the characters lead to the conflict, and the climax of the story. So they can physically be moving somewhere, they can make a decision. It's mostly character guided.
Right.
But in this story, I had a natural disaster, which had a very specific start point, and then it's, you have to run it through its conclusion. And so then the challenge then was, well, am I going to be jumping back and forth while this is happening? Do I adhere to the naturally occurring event and fit the actions of the characters against that fixed timeline, or do I stay with the characters and then alter that event back behind the scene so that I bring the characters up to where I want them to be when it happens? So I stayed with the characters. Does that make sense?
It makes sense,
Yeah.
and I'm glad you did it the way you did. I really am. I think it worked out quite well, actually.
Well, it's interesting because if I wrote it as a single event occurring, like this Scabland style flood,
right,
then the impact is only once. So you get it and then it's done. But I didn't want it to be just once. I wanted it to be multiple impacts from the same event, but to deliver it more than once, quite a few times.
yeah.
in a different context and through different eyes witnessing and how they respond to it. So in a sense, it's kind of repeating the disaster 2-3 times, as opposed to just once. Because I think if you do it once it's past you as the reader, then you just get on with things. And I didn't want you to get on with things. I wanted you to revisit it yet again and then again. So
Yeah.
And that's a very common technique in cinema, because you'll have that, oh, this thing is happening and these people are watching, go, oh my god, and then it'll cut to the different sort of point of view group, and it is actually jump back another either a few minutes or whatever to see the start of it happening again, so we get the event again from their perspective. And people still view that as a chronological sequence. They don't mind that, jumping back a little bit to see the same event again. It's not always, oh, now we're going to see it from this minute continuing. We see a lot of that in modern cinema. So it's not structurally strange to do that. It's quite I wouldn't say a common technique, but it's certainly well established.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the reason for doing it in cinema is the same as the reason for doing it in the fiction. You're adding layers of experience onto the same event, and that just that builds it further in a way that you couldn't do it if it was all occurring once as a sequence. And we've seen examples of that as well, where let's take the second Star Trek film, Abrams film, where the Enterprise crashes down into, spoilers here, San Francisco. And it's just, I mean, it's god awful, because it happens once, and we witness nothing of the consequences. We see nothing of work crews, removing rubble and carrying bodies away, and absolutely nothing. So it's one of those cases where it's the spectacle and all of the emotional context to the whole thing is just completely ignored. And this is, if you go back and revisit these things, and even in film and television, what AP is describing, where you take those 30-second step backs from different points of view, watching the same thing, psychologically, that is building the impact of that particular event, because it's kind of it's not one blow, it's hammer blows. It's just from all these different points of view, which really sort of raises the tension level. And it's like you've got a single event, but you've got multiple angles of observing it. And in many ways, the more angles you have, the more powerful the impact, I think, of that event. But if it's just spectacle and just CGI stuff and you're throwing it away, I mean, I'm when I see that, I'm personally offended by it, because it just seems so disrespecting of the consequences of something like that happening.
Yeah.
And then to add salt to the wound, after crashing their ship in San Francisco, they're handed a new one, the keys to the new one. It's like, what the hell? These, even in the regular Navy, if you're commanding a destroyer and you slam it into the docks, that's the last destroyer you've ever commanded. It's just, it's not like something that everybody just says, oh well, that's a mistake, and here's your new ship. It doesn't happen, but in Star Trek it does, apparently. So
but the point about spectacle in film, spectacle in TV, and even spectacle in literature, it serves a purpose. It is exciting, but I think one of the things that we have seen, particularly in a lot of Hollywood action or science fiction films, is that they forget that spectacle can be wedded to consequence, that spectacle can be wedded to theme, that spectacle can have substance at its core in addition to the spectacle. And I think part of the problem and part of the dissatisfaction that perhaps Steve and I have had with certain science fiction films is they have the spectacle, but it is almost empty and hollow.
It is
That,
almost. It is empty and hollow. Man of Steel. I mean, empty and hollow, right?
Don't get AP started on Man of Steel.
I'm
That's what I
trying to be
said.
balanced, Steve, because
Yeah.
there's more than, there are more than just those films that annoy us. But
Yeah.
that quite often they have the spectacle element, and they get caught up in the visual and the soundscape to give you this very powerful thing that's arresting your attention. And they forget that it's meant to be connected and grounded in the reality of the world, because that's inconvenient. That's not the story they want to tell. And instead of finding ways to incorporate that, sometimes now we get these throwaway lines that, oh, it's lucky they're fighting there because that island is uninhabited. So you can now have massive devastation and there are no lives lost. Or isn't it lucky that that's happening there because everyone went home at the end of the day and downtown is deserted? Because yes, anyone who lives in a major metropolitan area at 6 o'clock in the evening goes, right, everyone go home, and the whole of the town shuts down. No, that's not what happens. But they put in these throwaway lines as if it is going to address these deficiencies, instead of looking at the sequence of events, looking at the spectacle, and finding a way to build those elements into it to provide a more rounded and built out narrative.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just feels emotionally bankrupt. And I don't know if it's laziness or cynicism or whatever, but there's certainly something else going on there. And I guess in many ways, a lot of my fiction is almost consciously writing against that. And I want to sort of rail against it through my fiction.
Well, speaking of which, if you want to talk about disaster with the consequences explored, I think you do that a lot in your books, but in here, in The God Is Not Willing, you alluded to the natural disaster that is central to this book, and it isn't entirely natural, I suppose.
No.
I mean, the jagged are involved and all of that, and so there's a history behind all of this, but I couldn't help but think, and I'm sure you've heard this already a million times, but I couldn't help but think about climate change, and with the linked repercussions of refugees and dislocation and competition for scarcer and scarcer land, and so on and so forth. So that is something I feel that you're hitting on here. And were you thinking about all that when you were ahead of time, when you were planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think somebody had mentioned some early commentary on the book was that where the Malazan Book of the Fallen ended with a lot of sort of warnings, and this book is basically saying too late. Never mind with the warnings. But again, it ties into the role of the military. And think of the role of the traditional role of the military in natural disasters is one of the most honorable roles imaginable, which is to get to these places as quickly as possible and to save as many people as possible. Now, is that notion is it survivable in the face of the notion or the recognition that the people you're saving are not necessarily the people of your country? And that's the question that I wanted to ask in this. And I gave the Malazan answer to it, but it's just a Malazan answer.
Right. Yeah. So I think I've said this before when talking about your books, but I have a feeling that our survival as a species will depend on our ability to transcend our tribalism.
Yeah.
And that's something your writing really brings home to me, whether it's Malazan Book of the Fallen or Karkanis or this trilogy. So there you go. There's your voice again.
Yeah. Well, I guess in that sense, voice. You see, I mean, it sounds like you're recognizing commonality of theme, or at least an approach to things. and those are a bit harder to pin down in terms of on the page aspects of voice as relates to style. And so when I talk about variability of style, I'm not necessarily talking specifically about voice, because you're right, they're two very different things. And you can't even tie voice into specifically diction level, because quite often if you're holding to a third person close point of view, you drop to the diction level of the character that you're writing, or you rise up to the diction level. So even in that respect, I guess in terms of style, this one felt more, it felt very streamlined. Like all the fat had been trimmed away. And yeah, at the same time, if I look back on, my 1,000-page books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I don't see much fat. It's more the story was so big that it demanded as much as, everything that was in there. It demanded that be there. And that I actually slow the pace down to the extent that hopefully, people aren't too much feeling like they're slogging through anything, but that there is good reason for slowing down in the writing of that. And in this case, I think I just sort of, in a lot of respects, because of the original books and Cam's books, I didn't have to do a lot of world building in this first book of the trilogy. And that trims a lot immediately.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because it's a lot of the plot threads or story arcs in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in the volume where they appear, quite often are directly linked by theme to other things that are going on, that there are different ways of exploring that aspect of the story. Whereas in this one, because of the focus on the specific events that are being played out along those two lines, that's where the theme's being developed between those two things. So it didn't really require additional ways of looking at it, because a lot of the stuff, as you'd said, like even as part of world building in the previous series, had already been done. The environmental aspects, as far back as Dead House Gates, there were those sections of commentary about the desertification because of cutting down the trees and then the goat farming eating all of the saplings, and how the spread of the desert was done through that. That a lot of that has actually been worked into a concern of the Malazan world from very early on in the series. And so I see this as very much building on those consequences, and as it was framed that way, that those were the warnings, and then this is how it is now playing out. So it's focused very much on the repercussions of a lot of the previous actions.
Yeah, and a lot of those kind of observations about the certification and stuff, there in many respects they were more observational, because that's what an archaeologist, you have to recognize those factors at work when you're reading a landscape. And so there was that kind of angle to things where I could just be quite objective. This is what happens, and this is what the consequences are, without having to sound any sort of global warning. We've seen environmental disaster on some very small scales, but quite large for the people involved. Right. So there's a strong argument for environmental degradation as being pretty central to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, among other things. So soil depletion, soil exhaustion, deforestation. So all of these things are sort of, they can have a local impact, and they're all sort of representative of. That's why I always think in fractal terms, that what you see locally probably scales up. We just can't sort of perceive just the extent to which it scales up. But at the same time, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, when I was given the go-ahead on that, while I was writing Dead House Gates, I think was when I got the official start flag on the 10-book series. there was a strong sense of haste. I was compelled and impelled forward on that thing. So I wrote it pretty much as fast as I could to get it done. And at the same time, I threw everything I had into like every theme, every concern, every consideration, every aspect of the human condition that I could even think of was thrown in there. And that will always bulk up, you know, a project like that, because it becomes the definitive project of your career, or at least that's certainly how I viewed it, and it's how I still view it. Because it was also, to me, it was my peak energy period as well, you know, creative energy. And, you know, in the wake of that, you know, you're sifting through the ashes and figuring out what to do next. And I don't know if I have another 1,000-page book in me. I mean, Walk in Shadow might be, because there's just so much crap I have to fit in there. But
well, probably
I
not
think,
describing it as crap as a start.
no, yeah, whatever. But the Karsa trilogy, I'm seeing in my mind, I'm seeing a length fairly similar to The God Is Not Willing.
Well, there's a place for that too, though, you know.
There is, and yeah, Cam showed with settling in on a length that I think he's at his most comfortable in his path to ascendancy. So
yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up about The God Is Not Willing is the creation of some fantastic characters, because we'd mentioned Spindle, and he's actually quite a radically different character in this novel than he was, because he was the younger sort of almost recruit when we met him in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and now he's the world-weary veteran. So he's much more like a lot of those veteran characters we knew before, to these younger characters that we're getting to meet for the first time. And there are a couple of them that really do stand out, like Stillwater and Benger. And there is stuff I want to talk about Benger in a minute, because it relates to our discussion of various forms of magic that we've had in the past. But Stillwater, Philip, what did you think of Stillwater? Before we talk to Steve, what did you think of Stillwater?
Okay, fair enough. So she stuck out for sure. And what's interesting to me is I never quite settled on, now I know that the heavies are putting on an act of a sort. I know that a lot of the humor between these soldiers is an act. The one character where I wasn't sure, is this an act or is this something, this is the way her brain works, was Stillwater, because she just seemed like, in her own, you know, interior monologue, like she didn't understand why people would laugh when they laugh. That felt authentic to me. So she would say something and like Fullabore would, you know, laugh, it's a good one, you know, and she'd be like, why is he laughing? You know, so I thought that, I mean, she was just a really fantastic character, but I couldn't figure out entirely, because the others, I'm sure that some of it is an act, you know, and you settle into the routine of the act to some degree too, so that it almost doesn't, it becomes not an act almost. But with Stillwater, I felt like, no, her brain is different somehow, and this is just her, you know.
AP?
Well, I was going to say it's interesting that if you think of how you personally behave, say, with family, and then how you behave in the workplace, and how you behave, say, with a group of friends, you actually are not quite exactly the same person in each circumstance. That there is a kind of role and an aspect to how you portray yourself in the different arenas. And certainly, I think that goes to a wee bit about what Philip was talking about there, is that we do have these different registers, we do have these different modes of behavior, and we alter our behavior according to those circumstances. And Stillwater doesn't.
No, she doesn't.
She is Stillwater no matter the circumstance, which in one respect makes her stand out as in this unique perspective, because it is almost alien to how we conduct ourselves in our own lives. And yet at the same time, we always strive to be authentically us. And here is someone realized on the page who is authentically Stillwater.
That she is. That she is. Yeah. Yeah. Poor everybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's lucky she invented the whole mage assassin thing.
Isn't it? Yeah.
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 That was very fortunate for everyone. Yeah.
Also lucky nobody else knows she's a mage. Yeah.
Oh, was she a mage? I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
But you know, one of the fascinating things about that is, you know, obviously, like, the reader is let in very early on that she is a mage, and yet one of the things that you play with is you show very small moments throughout the book of each of the different Marines exhibiting magic, but you still refer to it like Benger is the mage or Clayplate is a mage. But all of the Marines actually have little moments where they use magic. And then when it comes to that reveal at the end of, oh, they're all also mages, it is still surprising, because it's only when you look back and you go, oh yeah, actually, all of them had been doing that all the way through. And you only sort of pick up on it in retrospect, which I thought was fantastic, because it goes to this natural evolution of the military, but also that very subtle thing of dropping the clues all the way through the narrative, that if you're paying attention, you go, oh, it shouldn't be a reveal, but it is still a reveal, and it still feels very, very natural.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to know about the other characters that sort of caught your eye. What about Captain Gruff?
Me? Oh gosh, I loved Captain Gruff. I mean, you started with the observation about his name. I can't remember if it was someone of the other characters who said, "Oh, the name is just perfect," you know. And immediately I felt there was maybe a bit of sarcasm there. Just a bit. So you never know with Malazan nicknames if they're actually describing the person or if they're describing the opposite of the person. In this case, it becomes clear pretty quickly which one this is. He's anything but gruff, but he also is kind of scary at times.
I hope so.
Yeah. He comes across as, you know, almost, don't be deceived, because he might seem as harmless. He's a very sophisticated individual, obviously. And when you hear someone speak the way he speaks, you don't necessarily think scary, but he has his moments of where he surprises you. And he's a captain for a reason. You know, he wouldn't just let anyone among those Marines become a captain. I was curious though, because he ends up coding himself with Otaterol at one point. And is that to protect himself from his own Marines? Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah. So that's a precaution, I guess.
Oh yeah.
So it's safe to assume that he is the one who doesn't have any magery. Then, if he's coding himself with Otaterol, then I would assume he's the one Marine there who doesn't have some kind of magery.
No.
Yeah.
And there's tactical reasons, there's organizational reasons for that as well. But
okay.
Yeah. Because Gruff was one of those characters, and I remember talking to you while you were writing this, that he was one of the characters that I loved, and there were two comparisons that I made. One was to the was it the vampire colonel in the Short Timers?
Yeah.
That it had he exhibited that level of menace at times, which is, you know, the very cutthroat. Like when they ask, like, have you done much wet work? And he's like, oh yes, of course. But the other character was the character that Tim Roth played in Rob Roy, who in front of his betters played the fop, and he had the exaggerated gestures, he dressed appropriately, he flattered everyone, he had the elevated language. And then when he was the highest social rank in the room, his demeanor changed immediately into someone who was much more cutthroat and much more dangerous. And I was seeing a lot of those elements in Gruff, that he is in some respects a dandy, but being a dandy, being a fop, was not a detriment to being a military practitioner, to being a military genius, or being a brilliant soldier. and being dangerous, that all of those elements were sort of encapsulated in him. And so he just was this wonderful bundle of different characteristics that you rarely see in military characters.
Yeah.
Mm.
The only other thing I'd say about him too is that when Gruff calls his soldiers darling, he actually means it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He means it. They are dear to him. So.
Oh yeah. But of course, I mean, strategically, you want your commanding officer to be immune to the magical influences of your soldiers, because none of them necessarily have the constraints necessary in every circumstance. And so I sort of thought, well, okay, if I'm going to have squads made up entirely of mages, the company captain is going to have to be the opposite, because then he's outside of all that kind of stuff. Because you could imagine, Benger as the captain, and that would be a freaking disaster, right?
The only thing worse would be Stillwater as the captain, I think. But,
yeah. Oh, I don't know, but yeah, certainly Benger.
But one of the things about his constant use of the Atadril is, like, obviously you make reference to it all the way through, but it's only at the end that it's spelled out and made very, very obvious that yes, it is Atadril dust. And when they're lined up to receive the charge, and they kind of put him as far away on the end of the line. So there are two big points here. Number one is he's standing with them. He's not some commander sending his troops out. Go and do this thing while I sit back here in the office. He's on the front line with them, and he doesn't have the magery that they have to protect him. So that I thought was a very telling moment for who his character is, that he stands with his soldiers, even though this could go very, very wrong, and he doesn't have the tools that they have to survive. But so I thought that was a brilliant moment. But also then can you step slightly further away, because the Atadril's bothering us and we need access to our warrens.
Yeah.
So I thought that was actually a great, and it was such a small moment, and it's not played for telling you about Gruff as a captain. Again, it's you deploying this sort of indirect characterization that, reading between the lines, you find out more about the characters. You look at the subtext and you understand it in the situation.
Well, for all the complaints leveled on me about showing not telling, I don't think I can change that. I'll always do indirect characterization as my first choice when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I mean, Stillwater, a lot of that's tied into her voice as well, and her internal voice delivers all the character I think that one needs. People like Benger, that's a little bit different. But
well, one more point on this, and then let's talk about Benger, because there's something I want to talk about in relation to that. But because there's actually a smaller cast really of your point of view characters, and because you spend a bit more time in depth with certain characters, I think a lot of readers actually see this as, you're doing more direct characterization. It's just it's the same style of characterization that was in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's just because there are fewer characters and they spend more time on the page, and they're not readers aren't moving between as many of them. I think people are going to find this that yes, they do understand this style of characterization, but it gives the appearance of it being more direct, when actually a lot of it is just as direct as it was, or just as indirect as it was in the Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Yeah, that's one consistency of style, I think, and for me, and that's basically because of what I learned early on in short story writing, contemporary fiction. I mean, I can't not do it. It's just how I write. So,
but let's talk about Benger. So, Philip, again, you've read this for the first time. So,
yes.
What are your thoughts on Benger?
Well, when you say Benger, there are a lot of things you could say about him, but what I chiefly remember, honestly, is how he helped Rand's mother.
Carlos.
Yes. And I thought that, I mean, that's in itself, I think, an example of what we were talking about when you talk about service and in the military and that sort of thing. And the idea that's what we do, we're here to help people, right? So I think he has that in common with all the other Marines, and he did that at great personal risk. Although he did put Stillwater and Annex Fro he threw them under the bus there a little bit too.
Yeah, I don't know if there was much personal risk involved when it comes to Bangor.
But regardless, I mean, I think his heart is probably in the right place. I think, nevertheless. And he's full of surprises too. Obviously, when he has the Otadero tossed at him, and we find out he's actually pretty scary with a sword too, So I thought that was cool. But he obviously has, I mean, there are various characters here with sort of deranged sense of humor, I think. And he's one of the more extreme ones, I suppose you could say. So I enjoyed the character thoroughly, along with the rest. But AP, what do you think about Bangor?
I think we should circle back to the healing scene as a separate sort of thing to focus on, because it's a fantastic scene, and I think it ties into a lot of different aspects. But I wanted to focus on one of the more humorous aspects of Bangor first, because obviously he's both a healer and an illusionist. And there are all of these moments where you realize that he just enjoys tricking people, that he is basically a bit of an asshole. That you have that, like, very early on, where I think he's talking to Ohms and he's going to go and infiltrate the camp, and they're having this conversation, and then Ohms go, "You've already left, haven't you?" And he's been talking to the illusion, and you don't know for how long. Or when Stillwater
cut on her finger,
and it's like, yes, I healed it. I always heal them, but then I always leave the illusion of another cut. That or when he hides the door to the spare room, in their billet, so that he can have a room that the others don't know about, and he just giggles to himself that he thinks this is hilarious. That you go, there's so much about this, about the fact that he's not just a healer, he is the illusionist, he is this trickster. And I think back to the Black Company and Goblin and One Eye and the tricks that they played on each other. Now, they were much meaner, I think, than Bangor. Bangor, I think, is a lot gentler than Glenn Cook's characters, who had a serious nasty streak. But the moment when he has his breakdown of questioning reality,
his existential crisis, yes.
And this is something that you and I have talked about before when it comes to illusion magic, which was a fascinating conversation, because I'd never thought through it this way. But Bangor, because he spends so much time creating illusions that are so real, that fool everyone, faking his own death and all of these different things, then how do you know what is real? And that breakdown, and Steve, we talked about this in relation to how potentially game breaking illusion magic is for RPGs. So can you explain that a little bit to Philip?
Well, I just found from experience that if I played an illusionist in a game, I usually broke the game. And it's usually because the capacity of pulling off very, very small illusions, but completely undermining sort of the entire, I guess, narrative drive of a storyline. An illusionist is capable of utterly messing up absolutely everything, to their own sort of gain. And for me, I always played those characters to the hilt, and that was always problematic.
Something tells me you enjoy breaking the game.
Oh yeah.
But like, even something as small as moving a keyhole, the appearance of a keyhole on a locked door, and moving it 1 foot to the left, which, you know what, it's a very small illusion. It's not a complex illusion spell. But the thief in the party who is trying to pick that lock will fail every time because that's not where the lock is. Or the appearance of a bridge going across a chasm. And you go, right, I'm going to move the bridge 5 feet to the right. And so everyone walks up and falls off.
Oh, no.
And when you're building up a consensus reality, when you're building up this diegetic reality that people have to visualize, when someone starts messing with your perception of it, where you can't trust what you're being told anymore, that breaks the diegetic reality. And these aren't incredibly powerful spells in a lot of role-playing games. Like, these are very simple illusions that don't require a lot of power. And yet you can see, as soon as you make the other players distrust what is being described. Oh, there's a door in front of you with a keyhole. Well, is there, or is this an illusion? And suddenly everything, you question every element. And that breaks down the entire diegesis that's being created as a consensual reality. And the exploration of that in this, where he has his existential crisis. And it's, yeah, that happens to illusionists a lot. At some point, they all go through this.
Yeah.
And it was this wonderful moment that that makes me think back to all of those discussions and how we talked about this, and the meta commentary on when you start believing in a reality, when you start imagining the diegesis of a literary work, when someone starts messing with that, that causes that ambiguity, it causes that distrust. And that's what we see with unreliable narration. It's what we see with embedded frame narratives and things going on, or metaleptic events. When people start messing with it, it creates that level of unease. And it's obviously one of the joys of reading that type of work, that you aren't just being told what is happening. And so that was the aspect of this that I thought was absolutely fantastic, tied into all of these other sort of meta elements, but I really enjoyed. And we're back. So I wanted to talk a bit about Benger's scene and the healing of Sarlis, because this ties into the repercussions of Karsa's actions that are being explored in Rant's storyline, but this is a different element. And we've seen in previous books, in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, different ways of exploring the repercussions of trauma and the repercussions of sexual assault and the repercussions of these things. And this is, again, addressing that, but in a different way, in that context that you were talking about of the military coming in as service to the community rather than the military as an invading force. And it also features a cameo of sorts of one of the classic characters, a variant of one of the classic characters of the series, in a shade of Anomander Rake. So Philip, before we ask Steve about it, what were your impressions of this scene?
Well, I think like a lot of fans, you mentioned Anomander Rake, and I was kind of delighted to see him because spoiler, he's not a character you expect to see again, I guess. No, I mean, it was a great scene because I mentioned how emotional I got while I was reading the book, and this is one of the scenes, and I think it has a lot to do with you, Steve, exploring the repercussions of what happened to Sarlis, what happened to this individual, and the pain that she was living with, not just from the incident itself, but the life that was a result of that incident, and her heroism in attempting to not deliver that pain to her child was just so powerful to me, and it was so heroic. And so, of course, I was rooting for Benger and Stillwater and Annex Fro to succeed and give this woman who had been so heroic some measure of relief from the suffering that she had endured. So I was very overwhelmed while I was reading all of this. And then I think what you did was you introduced some comedy into it as well, through Benger's antics and through Stillwater being Stillwater and Annex Fro being Annex Fro, and I'm glad you did that too, because that introduced a vein of lightheartedness into this scene as well. And so I had all this powerful, baseline emotions going on, but I was laughing at the same time, and I found it to be really one of the most effective scenes. I was very moved by what they were attempting to do, and it was also at the same time very bizarre. The fact that you're dealing with this mage, and this is one of the examples of you just going for it and doing something just sort of totally weird here. And I like that. I think that was a cool way to go about it. So I realized, I kept scratching my head and thinking, okay, this is illusion, right? But it didn't seem like illusion at the same time. I felt like I was actually seeing Anamanda Rake again, so so very cool scene for me. Yeah.
Well, it certainly left open as to whether or not that was an illusion of Rake or Rake. And even the scenario that then Rake describes in terms of his present fate, it's left open as to whether this is all Benger's construction or not. And I wanted to leave that open. And of course, the whole thing going on there is you really don't know what's real anywhere throughout that scene. You don't know whether this is Benger taking metaphors and just inventing illusionary but physical seeming objects and individuals and armies and all the rest. And then of course Stillwater's scarf gets involved as well, and that becomes other aspect of things. And
did
then
Benger really not know which dragon he summoned? Because he was like, I just saw it in a picture, right?
Yeah, you think he wouldn't know, right? Yeah. No, that's the problem, and it's the fun part about Benger, is that you can't trust anything, and I can't trust anything he says either. So, and that makes it a lot more fun. But it was, for me, the fact that it was Stillwater and Annex Fro rather than anybody else, I think, involved, I think was the crucial thing. Yeah. Because by this point we know Stillwater, and I think the reader has to be pretty leery about Stillwater at this point, because there are elements of her that are fairly indicative of sociopathic behavior. So so she's she's a bit of a wild card running all the way through this, and then Annex is her best friend who has to deal with it all, and so she's sort of the grounding element to all of this. But I'm curious as to when the emotional impact hit the hardest, because I always like to know where I got the reader, whether is it the scenes going back and forth from Sarlis's little room with the characters sitting there, is it right at the closing of the scene, which is actually Stillwater coming back to the door and knocking on the door?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the exact moment. I can identify exact moments in other scenes that just broke me. For example, when Rand says, we ask what is rape, that scene and the reaction to it, that just, I had to put the book down for a while. But the scene that we're talking about, I think it was when actually early in the scene, before he even starts with the illusions.
Oh, right.
And he had said in a very crude way that he needed women for this particular task. And when he was recruiting Stillwater and Annex Fro. But just, I think the intention of them going in there and the idea of them doing this out of an idea of service to help her. Just that the connection that was made in the beginning, and how vulnerable she seemed in the beginning, and why she thought they were there in the first place, and how wrong that was, and how they had to sort of just very gently tell her why they were there. So I think it was actually very early in the scene. That was before any actual healing took place even.
Interesting.
Yeah, that for me. Yeah.
Yeah. When I was reading it, it was that build up that was highly emotive. Then when we get the illusionary world and this exploration of what healing magic is and how Benger goes about it, because it's his way of conceptualizing it, that had, you know, the action and the humor, and that was a cathartic sort of release from the tension and the emotion built up. And then when that ended and we go back and Sarlis is healed, it brought back that seriousness again. So it was that movement between that, you had that moment of action and levity, breaking it up, which allowed you to process the drama and the tension and the emotion from the preceding scenes, and then to return to it, because this is a highly emotive and powerful sequence. That section and kind of in the middle of it was the breathing space needed to process the prior aspect before returning to the repercussions. And so much of this, I suppose I viewed as a literalized metaphor about the cycle of abuse and the cycle of trauma, and the battle that dealing with trauma is, that this war that goes on within you, dealing with trauma. And sometimes you need allies, sometimes you need people to help. And, you know, that's what we see literalized in this sequence. And I thought the inclusion of that with the the typical humor of the Malazans as a defense mechanism against being overwhelmed by emotion is something I can readily identify with.
Oh yeah.
So I really liked how that whole sequence played out. This Benger literalizing metaphors, trying to visualize what it is to heal something like this. And it isn't trivial. It isn't a easy wave of the hand and, oh, all trauma is gone. And we see that even Sarlis's life is that whole metaphor for how survivors of certain trauma are treated and stigmatized as a result of something that wasn't their fault, something that was perpetrated on them, and they have had to bear the stigma and the consequences of it. And to see that moment where just this once we get to see it corrected, and we get to see someone helped. And then Sarlis, then obviously in the rest of that, she goes on to have a new start, to decide what her life is going to be from that point on. She moves on. And
she moves on by faking repairs to Stillwater's uniform.
And she's like, you found it even in the wreckage of that flood. You found my old shirt, or
wasn't this thing on the other side? Oh no, we fixed that one. You know, it's this. I think there are certain ways that you can address topics like this, and one is in a very serious novel dealing with a lot of pathos, poignancy, and deal with it in that fashion. Or you can include it as part and parcel of another world and have it be part of an authentic reality. Treat it with seriousness and respect, but also the way that, you know, we see trauma dealt with in our world, that, you know, sometimes you need to laugh about these things. Sometimes it needs to be combined with that humor to give us relief. Otherwise it becomes so very serious that it becomes almost didactic.
And it was similar with Rant, and it's probably why Rant's journey required the two Jack. It required Nilgan and his brother. Because I needed to offset just the I guess heartbreaking innocence of Rant. Where these two brothers are resuming their lifelong game of one-upmanship. and bravado and all the rest, to play against Rant just sort of, I think, sort of beginning to show sort of innate aspects of leadership. And I think without them, it would have been much more difficult to do the Rant story. Even just Rant and Damisk, that would not have been enough, I don't think. So.
But, and again, it's this balancing of like the poignancy of Rant's storyline with and the seriousness all associated with that in a serious story in a serious world. This, you know, we believe in the Malazan world, but it gets balanced with that humor, and it is such an essential counterpoint, I think, so you can vary tone, that it doesn't become monotone, that it doesn't become so very serious that it's not something that pulls you in. That having those moments, I think, is absolutely essential to that type of story and how it's being told. And Gar, this is also one of the great things about this book, is the exploration of things that you've held very much as secrets and held back from the reader at various points. We see veering into divers in significant detail and explanation in this novel that we didn't see in previous books. It had been referred to, but this is almost, you know, here's the cards, I'm going to show you the cards now.
Yeah. I also want to say, in respect to Gower, that scene that I talked about before, where Rant is kind of cornered and he asks, and what is rape? And it's because Gower has been a comedic character for the most part. And his face crumples in response to Rant asking that question. And I can't remember exactly what Gower says, but something about, oh my, you know, oh gods, you know.
No, he says, oh shit.
Yeah, that's it. He says, oh shit. And his face crumples, and you realize, because he's the comedic character, that even the comedic character has broken down in that moment, and I'm broken in that moment. So just the effective blending there of the comedy and the tragedy is really well done.
It's one of the, if I think back on that scene, I probably hesitated for quite some time on the nature of Gower's response, primarily because he had been playing this particular role up to that point. And when you brought up the example of, you know, oh my God, or gods below,
right,
I'm sure I threw those lines out there to see if they were going to work, and those are not going to work. That's melodrama. As soon as I do that, that's melodrama. So his response had to be, this is why when I talk workshops and talk about dialogue, dialogue is not just two characters speaking. It can be one character speaking out loud to be heard by other characters. They're different things, right?
Right.
It's not a Q&A kind of thing. It's not an exchange kind of thing. It's a statement being made. And when you do that, then you're having your character comment on the scene as if they were standing outside that scene. So in other words, they are making a very natural comment that we would make in our world, but you don't quite often. I think beginning writers tend not to go in that direction, to actually have character make that kind of comment. They either act or react to whatever's going on, or they put into words in their dialogue very clearly what the reader is supposed to be thinking and feeling at this moment. And this was a case where him saying, oh shit, actually it's kind of jumping past what he might have said and taking to the repercussions. He's actually commenting on the repercussions or the realization that everything what Rant has just said has forced him to recontextualize his entire experience with Rant. Right. And that's what he's commenting on.
And I think so much more too, though, right? I mean, recontextualizing what he thought Rant was. But at the same time, isn't it also a reaction to Rant's experience, to the pain that he's understanding now that this boy has been through? It's just kind of, oh shit, you know.
Yeah.
It could also be that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very powerful scene. I had to put the book down for a while with that one and get a tissue.
Well, it's also, I guess, you know, one needs to sort of find means of letting the reader know, just as the characters are being revealed, are discovering these things, that Rand's point of view is a far less nuanced point of view than the readers.
Yeah.
And so the reader is also, you know, making the same recontextualization of that Gower is doing at that point. At least that's the purpose of you know, writing a scene like that.
Yeah.
Well, Philip, are there any other sort of standout scenes or characters that you
So
wanted
many
to talk about?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there are so many, but I do want to talk a little bit about Rant's relationship with Damisk, and because I think that that hit me in ways that I didn't expect as well. And I didn't like Damisk at all in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, where he appeared. Yeah, I think I respected his toughness and resilience, but he was not he was never a perspective character, I think.
No.
Or anything like that, but clearly a survivor of a sort, but one who survives almost through cruelty, I think, or indifference to other people's pain, perhaps is the way to put it. And you have a character here who has aged and has changed his perspective somewhat as a result of experience, and has certain views of humanity that about our stupidity, and he's not entirely wrong about that, I think, sometimes in my more cynical moments. But I suddenly found myself really resonating with this character in ways, and was curious about the fact that we talked a little bit about that word redemption earlier, and it's a huge, important theme in here. And can somebody like Damisk be redeemed from the life that he lived all those years by a simple act of saving one boy? When he, and, you think of the tragedies that he was responsible for, and the atrocities that he committed, being involved in the slave trade and all of that. And I find myself pulling for the guy, though. I find myself rooting for him, even knowing all that, because of this relationship that he struck up with this boy. And I don't think he did it thinking, oh, I have to redeem myself, so I better do some nice thing, I'm not help the old lady cross the street, sort of thing. So I get my badge. I don't think it was that. I just feel like it was a natural instinct that he obeyed, and then he followed through with it. And as to whether or not he's redeemed, I don't know if that's even an answerable question, is it?
No, well, it's certainly, I mean, he would answer it, absolutely not. There's a point there, I think, early on when, Rand says something about, doing good deeds. And I think Damisk says something like, well, it's a start, but it's, there's a long ways to go. And he's not expecting it. I mean,
right.
He's a character facing with his growing obsolescence. And I find that to be, a fascinating character. In some ways, I can identify very clearly with that character. And so it either forces introspection or self-destruction, I think, are your two options at that point. And so he is lived long enough to witness the end of the culture that he lived in, and that it's changed in unrecognizable ways. And so once it's reached that point of unfamiliarity, the only thing he's got familiar that he can fall back on are nature, the wilds of nature.
Yeah.
And so that is why the strange migration of the caribou is what sort of shifts everything for him. That's his crisis point. And you know, again, in terms of writing and talking about writing, you want characters, even though they may appear first initially in a fairly static or passive state of being, to actually be at the moment of crisis, or brought to the moment of crisis as early as possible, so that they develop as a character who is forcing themselves to adapt to a new reality and a new mindset. And that is always a much more interesting character than one who's decided everything is as it is and will never change that particular point of view. And nothing of the story or the plot actually alters it. To me, that's a death knell of characterization. You know, if you're going to take a character like that, you want to hammer them by the end of the novel. You know, you want to completely obliterate them. And so
talk.
Oh.
Talk? In what way?
If any character suffered more hammering and more abuse in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I don't think there was one.
Yeah, but not for that reason.
No, and I know not for that reason.
And at least he got hugged.
Yeah.
He got a lot of hugs.
He got a lot of hugs. Yeah.
But it's interesting because the opening scene with Damisk, as he's watching the caribou, and he's like, oh, you know, if I was younger, I would have alerted all the hunters and we would have killed all of these things. And you can see, oh, this is all terrible, and I'm not going to do that anymore. And then he reaches down and picks up the 5 rabbits that he's caught. And I actually, that is one of those moments that I love, the contradiction of the human condition. That he looks at this, he sees this migration of the caribou, and he's like, I'm not going to do that anymore. But these 5 things that I've just killed.
Yeah.
And he misses it. He misses it. Then he gets confronted by Rant and the repercussions of the slave trade that he was engaged in, because Karsa's journey would not have happened the same way had not slaving been part and parcel of what was going on in that region. And I think Damisk quite clearly says, as you'd said, that they were talking about the marks on a soul, and maybe this will erase one, but his soul is covered in marks. He doesn't deny that. Even the harness that he uses to save Rant is the slave harness he used to use to capture people. Yeah. There are all of these very complicated emotions and aspects of his character tied up in this. And then we see that moment where he makes the decision to go with Rant, knowing that it will be his death. He is not getting out of this. And he makes that decision. Does it redeem him as a character? And as you said, like Damisk would say no, because he cannot make up for what he has done. But do you then just double down and go, well, you know, if I can't make up for it, I'm just going to continue to be that person? Or do you try to turn your life around? And we see that that is what Damisk does. And I think that's what makes him so compelling. And I think part of the thing that we get drawn into sometimes is this character is good, this character is evil. That here is a good character and we root for the good character, and here's an evil character and we can hate the evil character. And we keep saying we want complexity, and we keep saying that we want flawed characters. But what we want are good characters who have a flaw that we can excuse. We want evil characters who can do things, but we can still call them evil. We still like that dichotomy. We still like that binary. And when we're faced with truly complex characters that have these backstories that reveal that they have been involved in things that just are unforgivable, how can we then come to to like them, to be engaged with them, to see this part of their journey. And it is a very challenging assumption, or it challenges that assumption that we have when we make these sort of judgments and declarative statements about people, about characters. And Damisk for me is a fascinating character because he challenges those things in much the same way that Karsa does and did.
Sure.
That, you know, we don't forgive Karsa for what he did. It's not about celebrating what Karsa did. It's about understanding it in context, which is not the same as forgiving or accepting. It's about understanding that a character moves on from that, but that will always be part and parcel of their lives. So that's what I find fascinating about Damisk, and how it connects to Karsa, both in terms of the narrative as well as sort of almost thematically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I knew Damisk wasn't going to survive the novel, and I hadn't quite worked out where and how the conclusion of his arc was going to play out. But curiously, when I got to a little scene early on where he describes the last cave bear on this side of the mountains, which eventually got hunted down and killed, I had my answer. I realized it's at least symbolically the mate of that last bear on the other side of the mountains. So.
I'm curious about one thing too in his arc. It's not as if we all have a scale where our good deeds are on one side and our bad deeds are on the other, but does Damisk's freeing of the god who is chained and who exacts a vengeance of a sort on the Kachane Chamal?
Of a sort? Vengeance of a sort? Yeah, I'd say pretty absolute, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an interesting moment, though, I thought, too, in his journey, for sure.
Yeah. I haven't decided what to do with that god yet, but it might show up again. We'll see.
Yeah.
But also, and again, directly related to he used to be a slaver and then freeing someone from bondage. Like you see these parallels. And these echoes and mirrors of various things about the characters. And Rant's storyline as a coming of age narrative, but again, quite a different coming of age narrative than, say, we typically expect to find in a fantasy novel. And you know, I like, one of the things that I enjoy about reading books like this is a narrative that makes sense, a narrative that has all of those elements that are consistent with one another, that fit together, that there is a narrative logic at play. But I'm not predicting everything that happens in it. And I think we've all had that experience of reading a novel where after the first third, you can now, not exactly, but pretty closely predict what narrative events are going to happen, in what order they will happen, and you know how it is going to conclude. That does happen. And when we get books like this that challenge assumptions, and it's not just about subverting expectations for the sake of subversion, it's about challenging conventions and saying, no, while this is conventional, you don't have to do it that way. You can still have a compelling narrative that fits and flows, but it doesn't have to follow that pattern. You can do something. You can have poetic elements, you can have dramatic irony, you can have these different elements worked in so that it reads in a different way.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot from working the Karkanis stories, because the outcome is known in at least general sense of the sundering of the realms. And then as the writer, you then have that constraint you have to work under. And early on, I sort of made a vow to myself that I was never going to write and conclude something in a predictable fashion. So in other words, I did not want the readers to be able to guess what's coming. And I still hold to that. I don't want the readers. And so if you give them enough information to say that, well, what's coming here is a flood, or what's coming here is the breakup of Curled Galen, from Thais Leosen, from Emerland, and the breakup of everything else. Those cannot be your surprises when you come to the end of the book, right? Because they're known. And so one has to sort of come up with different ways of surprising the reader. And that's one of the things that's one of the challenges, I guess, that I look forward to the most, is confounding reader expectation. And of course, the more information you give out, the more you're limited. And so I know, AP, you talked at length when you were doing the advanced reading on the knife that Rant acquires and the means by which he acquires it. I'd be curious to know if Philip had any responses to that particular scene.
That's an interesting scene, and we gradually figure out that the entity that Rant traps in the knife is a Shagail assassin, right? Essentially, and he names her. It seems to be a her 3, right? Yeah.
I mean, he's not great on imagination. So.
Yeah. He's no Braden Tooth, I guess.
No.
When it comes to the nicknames, but no, I thought that was fascinating, and the relationship that ensues between the two of them, and it's interesting because there's a juxtaposition there, isn't there, between this innocent and this ancient being whose purpose was assassination. So there is a degree of, they're opposites in a way, but they're also, I think, a source of consolation for one another, because there are moments later on where Rant feels abandoned by him, and he says, "Are you going to leave me too?" And the knife answers, "No, I'm not leaving you." So, so it's interesting what develops between them, and I love the in the same way that I love the scene later on with War Bitch, and what you do with the time there, and the sort of we're in a different realm here. We're in we're back in creation time, or we're in I think that's what Mircea Eliade used to refer to it as, creation time, I think, right? Where you can go back to the beginning of things and manipulate things. And so I was fascinated by those parts very much, and what happens with Rant and 3, and the fact that he gets to carry her around with him in the knife is one of the aspects of his development that I like that a lot, and it wasn't something I ever could have predicted, by the way.
Good.
Good. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's I don't know if I should go here, but there are other aspects to all of this, and that is Sarlis taking a knife and threatening to take her own life, that drives Rant out into the world. And then, the knife as representative of a mother figure. And then so the mother figure returns to him in this fashion. But I think what AP was commenting on, if I recall correctly, was this was an aspect of we actually get to see how a weapon becomes magical.
Right. I mean, we've seen it before to some degree, right? Where Karsa has, and maybe it's in his mind, maybe it really is, but his two friends, Bareth Gild and Delon Thord, are bound in his flint sword. I think also Samar Dev has a knife where there are spirits bound inside it, right? So we've seen this in the Malazan world before, but this is, I think, is as close up a view as we've ever gotten.
Yeah, AP.
Yeah, and well, one of the aspects, obviously, that I liked about it was the fact that 3 is, in some respects, a monstrous mother. and the aspect of her wanting to protect Rand, but in a weapon. The weapon as a form of protection, rather than, you would think protection, shield, offense is the weapon, but she's the mother in the weapon. And when we think of where did he get the knife from in the first place, it was given to him by the Marine. It was given to him by the Malazan, which is an absent father figure. So again, there's a lot of symbolic links to the mother figure, the father figure, absences, monstrosity tied into this. And one of the things that tied all of it together was the tree that is growing in this place of power is twisted and shaped by the power, that it has grown into this spiral. It is not the normal shape of a tree, and it is therefore unique. It is therefore still beautiful. It has been shaped by this power. It has been shaped by the trauma. It is not the usual tree, but it is still a tree. It is still unique. It is still special, and it is still beautiful. And it's Rant dealing with the legacy that he has been left with of both the blood oil and Karsa's power, as well as the abuse that he suffered in the village and the complicated relationship with his mother, has been shaped by all of these factors. He has been twisted out of the normal shape that we would expect, but it has not broken him. It has made him into something unique. It has made him into something beautiful, and that grows in a way that is unexpected. So those aspects, I think, are tied up in this moment. And so it's a lot of different symbols and metaphors coming together with an interplay between them that creates a lot of meaning and resonance and echoing across these multiple levels. And that's one of the things that I genuinely enjoyed about it. And I thought was a great symbol for the journey that we go on with Rant, that this tree that has been shaped by factors beyond its control, that all it can be is itself, and to try to be the best tree that it can be, but it has been shaped by these things. So that's part and parcel. I think there were a few other things as well, but that was some of what I saw in that scene that I thought was important.
Yeah, the for beginning writers out there, we can use this as a possible example in terms of world building, but not world building just in the sense of fantasy settings, but world building in the sense that it applies to all fiction. The things that the details you throw in there are not just there to fill up the background. So when you come up with a number of these things, I would recommend not shying away from the symbolic side of things. I remember in Iowa, my instructor there thought the complete opposite of what I think in terms of fiction. And his view was the author should never even think about theme or symbols, because if you start thinking in terms of symbols, they become really obvious. And I disagree completely. I think a writer can be far more subtle in that respect. So when you have certain things that you want to tie into, what's your story about? And when you answer that question, if you can answer it in thematic terms, that's pretty useful. So you diagram this stuff, and so you've got this twisted tree, you've got this knife. These are just small examples of what's thrown into a scene when you're building your scene, that you then can pick up and take with you to explore on a symbolic level, and add more purpose to those particular props. So, in writing the scene with Rand's mother and Rand, which was not an easy scene to write, but the conclusion of it with the knife, I mean, that was just me picking up whatever was nearby at her table with which she could threaten her own life. And then once having created that scene, to look back on it and think, well, what can I use out of that scene that actually relates to where Karsa's journey is going to take him? And the knife immediately came to mind. So that, in terms of the writing process, go back over what you've just written and see if there's anything there that can be, pulled out of the toolbox and return to, because what that often does is it binds your entire story together on a subtextual level that the reader is not consciously aware of, but it has to be there in order to unify the story. So, for example, if that weapon had been, I don't know, a hatchet given to him by not a Malazan, but by some, woodcutter, it does not fit, right? It doesn't fit with the rest. It doesn't fit with the rest of his subtextual stuff. It doesn't fit with the themes. So, I'm dealing with a boy who's literally, well, not literally, but is to some extent an orphan, even though he has a mother, and is certainly an isolate within the community. And so there has to be you need a father form, which can change face. It can become Damisk at one point. And prior to that, it's this faceless Malazan Marine who protects Rant from having stones thrown at him and stuff like that in his community. So one has to think, if Rant is this kind of orphan figure, then you need stand-ins for father and mother, and if his circumstances to begin with are so twisted away that even his mother can't be his mother, then we need stand-ins for that as well. Wow. So in terms of structuring your storylines and mapping things out, that's the kind of note-taking I do. I don't do plot-related note-taking. I do, let's connect these things subtextually, and they'll all fit.
And to perhaps further illustrate what you're talking about, you bring this symbol full circle in a way when you have Rant saving Spindle later on with that very knife.
Yeah.
And Spindle being a stand-in for that anonymous Malazan who gave him the knife in the first place. And Rant even says, "Thanks for the knife," or something like that.
For the knife was his...
Oh yes, for the knife. Yeah.
I remember, I think AP, when you first read through it, you didn't think it was as effective as it could have been. And I still don't know if it was or not, but it was the only way I could sort of play out Rant's final answer to that Marine. So,
no comment.
I mean, AP and I we don't agree on everything, right? And that's his job. Is that?
Well, if I just agreed with everything you put on the page, what's the point in me giving you feedback?
Absolutely. So yeah, I still don't know if that scene was as effective as it could have been.
It worked for me, and like I said, I felt like you brought things full circle there in that scene. And when he says "for the knife," I felt that.
Well, that was the plan. So there, AP.
Also, I don't pretend to be omniscient. That I am fallible. I am only human, unfortunately. I'm not always 100% right. I'm 99.9% right.
Right.
But you could even extend like aspects. One of the techniques, obviously, that you use in terms of this mirroring and echoing, ohms being ohms is possession, and that particular aspect we see then 3 in the knife. We see the almost Annex Fro as the comedic aspect with the Weasley Stoat thing. But
yeah,
there are all of these different points, these different mirrors, these different ways of exploring it. Even Stillwater with the possessed scarf. There are these aspects to it, and it's not it's not the inclusion of, say, like magical items the way that you have in like, say, D&D, where you turn over a rock and there's a new magical +1 sword. Um, a lot of the magical artifacts and a lot of these things have resonance and points of connection to other aspects, which is what gives them, I think, a lot of their meaning and a lot of their importance in the text. And seeing it again explored in different ways, this concept of a monstrous mother who is protective but also dangerous, seeing different aspects of that explored, and again, not in a didactic sense, not in a pejorative sense, exploring these very concepts to see that things generally are far more complex than the simplistic concept that gets trotted out as a label usually signifies.
Yeah, but that's the bread and butter for the writer, right? To recognize that things are much more complex, and to at least convey some aspect of that complexity, or to use that complexity in building character and story.
Yeah. Well, Philip, we've been going for some time now. Is there anything else that you would like to bring up with Steve about The God Is Not Willing?
Yes, one last thing. I just want to thank you, Steve.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, I mean, this book was just an incredible read, and very, very happy to have read it and to have been very moved by it. And I want to congratulate you on another fantastic book. So
thank you.
Yeah, just beautiful stuff. And so thank you. And thank you for this discussion. And thank you, AP, for being a marvelous host and a great guy and somebody who's right 99.9% of the time.
Yeah, it unfortunately slightly fallible. But yeah. Philip, thanks for being here. Thanks for coming on and having the discussion. Steve.
Wait. I thought there was one more thing coming from Philip. Was there?
Yeah,
Did I misunderstand?
No, just thank you.
Oh, it's just
one more thing was he was thanking you. God, for someone who is such a smart writer, you can be a blind, oblivious human being at times, Steve.
Yeah, tell me about it. I know.
That was the one more thing, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So, Steve, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about the book. I really do appreciate it. Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
And for those of you still watching, thank you for your support. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.